Hello everybody, welcome to another episode from the DJ Anesh series, bringing you the best in Southeast Asia history. We are back! Welcome back everybody! The common tests are done and dusted. I hope you had a good experience with it. Hope that you did yourselves proud, and we will move on from here. The next checkpoint that we have are the promotional exams, and that's coming soon, I think sometime in October. So let's work towards that. I'm really proud of you guys for going through the common tests, especially the two Southeast Asian questions that I threw at you guys. Admittedly, as I mentioned before, it was a difficult set of questions. Showing it to your seniors and the alumni, they were also like, whoa, giving this to J1s. I thought that was a real challenge, and you guys rose up to it. Some of your friends, I've asked them to type out their essays, and you can see. Or you can use them as reference material, moving forward from here. We can all learn as a community, because the J1 essays, I'm kind of letting the J2s have access to it as well, so that they can also revise for their political stability and national unity topics. So you guys are helping them. Next year when you guys are J2, the J1s will help you, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole cycle, 2-year family kind of thing that we got going on over here. And yeah, I hope that you guys are having a good experience so far. I know this year has been bad, but yeah, let's continue to keep going at it. I think you guys are doing great, and if you are with me, I'm with you. Today we are going to go into the next theme. Okay, so in semester 1 and the first half of term 3, we were really covering a lot of things to do with theme 1. And in fact, I'm done with theme 1 for this year. So with regards to theme 1, there's nothing really new anymore. But next year in J2, I will pick it up with you guys again. But we are done with theme 1 this year. So we're done with political stability content. We're done with national unity content. Now, we are going to jump ahead to theme 3. Okay, Southeast Asia, paper 2, theme 3. And theme 3 is this theme called regional conflicts and cooperation. Wow, it's quite exciting, right? Like dramatic music, sound effects, thunder rolling, that kind of stuff. One of I guess by now, with the title itself, you can tell that we are moving from the national to the regional. So once again, the title is called Regional Conflicts and Cooperation. The specific topic that we are going to go into now is called interstate tensions or interstate conflict. So we are really looking at a conflict between nations. You can see that our peripheral view is now on the region rather than just on the nation. But let me kind of caution you guys, or not caution but I guess just encourage you guys to retain your memory, your very expensive memory for theme 1, because it's the same timeline. We're looking from roughly 1945 to the year 2000. Same timeline. We are dealing with the same characters, the same case studies, the same countries, the same whatever, the same leaders. We're looking at the same ones, but now we're just adopting a more regional lens. So whatever you guys had learned from theme 1, maybe it would affect your understanding of what's happening in the region over here in theme 3. So that's the first big difference. The second big difference is that this topic is an SPQ topic. Okay, so Southeast Asia also has its SPQ component, and this is it. Theme 3, interstate conflicts, and later on something about ASEAN. These are SPQ topics. So I kind of want to get you guys started on SPQ this year as well for Southeast Asia, and this is the start of the whole journey for that. Okay, so those are the two biggest differences. We got to switch our minds a bit, national to regional, and number 2, this is an SPQ topic. So if you guys are ready to go, let's go into the content itself. Now, for the first case study that I want to use, pretty exciting one. I think it's a good representation of the kind of interstate conflict that is going on in Southeast Asia at that point in time, I think it's a good representation to see how conflicts can escalate really fast and really violently. It's also a good conflict to show the involvement of external powers beyond the region. So this conflict that we are going to go into has all these kinds of dimensions, and I kind of want to explore them with you guys. And today's lecture is going to be, more or less about the content about this conflict itself. The conflict that I'm referring to is called Konfrontasi. Translated to English, sometimes you may see it being referred to as the Indonesian confrontation against Malaysia. So it could be phrased that sometimes you might see a direct translation of the Indonesian campaign slogan. When translated, it is called Crush Malaysia. So we have all these kind of terminology for the same event, but basically we are looking at how Indonesia confronted Malaysia to the point where it was aggressive, where it was belligerent, where it escalated into a security crisis, and then finally we are going to be looking also at how eventually was this resolved, how was this conflict concluded. So that just gives you an idea, the grand narrative of what's going to happen today in the podcast. But before that, let's go into the syllabus document. You can see it's switched up already. This is reflecting theme 3 of your syllabus for the Southeast Asia paper. Going into the content, we are basically, it's quite simple, it's quite straightforward, looking at the causes and consequences of interstate tensions. So we are looking for the genesis. We are looking for the motivations. We are looking for the reasons why tensions and conflicts exist. Why were they born in the first place? What were the motivating factors that led up to the crisis itself? So when we think about these kind of questions, right, about the genesis or the motivations of the conflict, two things would have to come in mind. The first thing, definitely, you're going to ask yourself, who do I blame for this conflict? Come, let's shine the spotlight at him. Let's interrogate the parties and, let's find out who's responsible. So, naturally, the first area of focus that we have is on responsibility. Usually, hypotheses like this would pin the blame on one of the parties, and the sources would revolve around those kind of focus. So, perhaps we are looking at a hypothesis like, to what extent should Konfrontasi be blamed on the Indonesian government? Or to what extent should Konfrontasi be blamed on the Malaysian government? So usually they are going to identify human actors as the given factor in the hypothesis, and they're going to ask you to assess the degree of responsibility associated with that factor based on the sources. So that's the first one, responsibility. The second one is on the nature of the conflict. Now, the nature of the conflict, if I am to translate, if I'm to synonym like, thesaurus, like I'm thesaurus.com, and I want to translate nature to something, I think what a good guess of it would be like the characteristics. We're looking at the characteristics of the conflict. We're looking at the core issues of the conflict. So this one is more of like, what describes the core nature of this conflict? Right? What was it really about? I think that's the essential question. What was it really about? What was it really motivated by? Okay, sure, the human actors are the ones, they're the chief agents, they're the drivers of the conflict, sure. But what were they acting on? What kind of issues, what kind of concerns do they have? And kind of like you need to evaluate the myriad of factors and issues that are involved within the conflict. So examples of this today we'll cover, it could be down to something to do with security. It could be something to do with sovereignty. It could be something to do with the leader's ambition. It could be something to do with domestic politics. One of the key things that we are going to cover today is, even though we are looking at the regional, how can domestic politics affect what's happening at the regional level? So that's something I did say earlier, and I just want to kind of like remind you all to look for these kind of connections when you're studying this topic. So that's for the content. Learning outcomes, it's mostly tied to causes and consequence. So analyze the causal relationships that underpin the development of interstate tension. So that's just a fancy way for saying, what are the factors that cause the conflict, and evaluate their impact on interstate and regional relations over time. So we're looking at the consequences, the impact, how escalated was it, how easy to resolve was it, what kind of damage did it do to relationships, were these damages sustainable over the long term, things like that. So that's the learning outcomes, and your hypothesis would largely revolve around this learning outcome over here. The last thing over here you can see is what I put there, national and regional. I did talk about this already, so I won't belabor the point, but it's really about the connections between what's happening at the domestic level versus what's happening at the regional level, but at the same time, looking at the relationship and the connections between these two levels, seeing how they mutually can affect one another, seeing how they mutually can motivate one another. Now, this probably excites you. I know right now, looking at this, you're getting goosebumps and you're like, tears are flooding your eyes and you're like, whoa, what a crazy ass conflict. I think upon first glance, you can see that there are many, many different highlights of this conflict. And you can see that actually I've taken some liberty with the timeline because I've stretched it out quite a bit. The conflict itself is actually, from the official declaration of confrontation to kind of like the end of confrontation, honestly, it's only about like 2 years, maybe 3 years plus. So it's a rather short conflict, but that doesn't mean that it can't be devastating. That doesn't mean that it didn't involve a lot of complex issues. But I've stretched the timeline here a bit because I kind of want to get a contextual understanding going as well. As you understand this conflict, we can't just look at 1963 to 1965. We kind of have to look in the years preceding that and leading up to this. So the timeline over here, actually you can see that there are many milestones and events and all that. To be honest, it is not in its entirety. It is not exhaustive, meaning to say that there are more things you can add to this timeline. But this is based on my selection, on what I feel are the more important milestones, the more significant ones, to help me explain and to help me analyze the sources and the causes of the conflict. So that's kind of one of the key skills I want to talk to you about as well, though, which is that you can come up with timelines, and timelines are really important to understand the historical narrative, the story as it goes. But I think a key question over the years, kids always ask, like, what do I put inside? What's important? I don't want you all to flood the timeline as well. So you need to be a bit discerning about the events and the milestones that you include within your timeline. And how do you do that? Actually, I gave you all the answer just now, which is that I first have a question in mind. My question here was, what are the key events or key movements that cause this conflict? What are the significant or relevant points in time that would play a part contributing to this conflict? So based on that question, I then only start to form my timeline, right? It doesn't make sense for you to read the readings or the notes and then like list down every single thing on earth, because not everything will be useful for you or for the argument. Okay, now we're going to spend some time on this timeline because there's quite a bit of content to unpack. So if you need your tea or coffee or drink or whatever it is, now's the time to get it. You can pause. But we're going to get into this timeline a bit. So we're going to go into a bit of content before the next few slides will take us into the nature of the issues itself. So let's go into content first. If you're ready, let's go ahead. Now, I bet you if I ask you right now, when did Indonesia gain independence, the whole cohort would resoundingly and confidently know the exact date, maybe even to the exact hour, minute, second of which the Declaration of Indonesian Independence was promulgated. I'm that confident in you guys that you all know all these things. In fact, I'm to ask you now, hey, when was Burma, when did Burma gain independence, or when did Vietnam or Singapore or Malaysia or Philippines, wow, I'm sure you all know it as all the way. Even if I ask you Thailand, you'll be able to tell me, hey, Mr. Koh, that's a trick question. Thailand was never colonized, right? Okay, so let's start from August 1949. Indonesia gains formal independence. Oh, by the way, we are starting from left to right. Okay, so we're going to go through the thing. Now, again, it's important to know the domestic developments first because this issue doesn't naturally start out as a regional issue. It doesn't naturally start out as a conflict between nations, right? There are some rumblings that are happening within the domestic scene first, and then after that, it would spill over into the bilateral or the regional landscape. I'm gonna so okay, yeah, so and I need you to recap a bit about Team One and that kind of stuff. Remember that Indonesia under democracy is not doing well. So by 1955, somewhere around 1957, Indonesia transits into guided democracy, and guided democracy is just another form of authoritarianism, and power is centralized and is really fixed squarely on Sukarno. Now, why is this important? Is because in this conflict, the role of the leader, the role of the leader's personality, the leader's agenda, the leader's conceptualization of the region is going to play a really big part as a causal factor. So, you see, that's what I mean. I can't just jump into 63 and see what Sukarno is doing. I need to understand that by 1955 to 1957 or so, Sukarno has immense control over Indonesian society. Particularly, Sukarno has immense control over foreign affairs. Now you start to see the connections that are linking the domestic to the regional. Okay, it starts with small kind of developments like this. Let's go on further. Now, you take it a few years later, and now there are some rumblings to the north of Indonesia, where there is now beginning to be serious talk about the formation of, or it raises this idea of a unification of several states, including Malaya, Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak, and Brunei. Now, keep in mind that Malaya, okay, Malaya by this point in time is independent already because Malaya gets independence in 1957. I'm sure you guys knew that, right? In your heart, you say, "Oh, Mr. Koh is gonna say that." Yeah, I know, correct. So you guys know that. So Malaya by this point in time, 1957, they have already actually gained independence. Okay. However, these other territories that you see over here, Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak, Brunei, technically they are still under colonial rule. Okay, but it's a very complex process, but there begins talks about the idea of decolonizing all of these other states, but the British feel that they are not ready to be independent as individual entities, right? They're not ready to be independent in themselves because of Cold War concerns and domestic instability in these states and all that kind of stuff. Long story short, the British sets these kind of standards and these kind of prerequisites that we are willing to decolonize, but we are mooting this idea of a federation of states called Malaysia. So, guys, this I know we take it for granted now. Malaysia is like Malaysia law, like it's always been like there since the dinosaurs and that kind of stuff. But no, Malaysia is actually a construction, right? Malaysia is a construct. It is something mooted in the early 1960s. It is discussed, it is proposed, and there are many processes involved in constructing this new nation called Malaysia, which is actually a federation of a few component states, of which the original plan included Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak, and Brunei. So, of course, I think you might know the narrative about this, but just bear with me and let me get through it. One of the questions you might have now is about Brunei, and some of you might know already lah. Like when Malaysia was eventually formed in 1963, Brunei wasn't part of it. So long story short, Brunei kind of like decided not to join the federation. because of their own reasons and all that kind of stuff. So eventually, the Federation of Malaysia only consisted Malaya, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak. So by the early 1960s, there are already high-level government meetings in London, and basically, in principle, they approve the proposal and announces that a commission will be set up to ascertain the wishes of the peoples of North Borneo, which is Sabah and Sarawak. Okay, so the idea here is that there is an okay actually the idea here is that there is an idea. Okay, there is a proposal for a new nation, a federation of states coming together, and now the processes for creating this new federation begins. Okay, we're not saying that this is confirmed set in stone, because there are certain outstanding problems, and they need these kind of problems to be addressed first before the Malaysia can be born. One of the things you see over here, ascertain the wishes of the peoples of North Borneo, Sabah and Sarawak, because they wanted to ensure that them joining the federation is of the will of the people. It's not something that's forced, but it's something desired by the people. So there is legitimacy in this federation. There is legitimacy in creating this new nation because it is of the will of the people. So certain processes like this need to be enacted first and ascertained first before the country really comes into being. At this point in time, maybe I'm assuming a bit too much or so, but some of y'all might be asking, oh, what's a federation? So a federation is okay. So for many large countries, they can be modeled along the lines of a federation, where there is kind of like there is a center, but there are many regions and there are many different states in this country as well that are beyond the center. Power, like a lot of power, would reside in the center, but the other component states, right, would have their own individual autonomy as well to control certain affairs within their territory. So there are some things that only the central government has the power and authority to decide. But when it comes down to state level matters, the local governments have a lot of power on their own as well. So a federation is one single country, but there are many different centers of power within that country. There's a good degree of autonomy across the states as well, and but there is a central government. So in this case, the Federation of Malaysia, the proposal is going to be modeled after the central government being in KL, Kuala Lumpur, and the component parts of Singapore, Sarawak, Sabah, they have their own local autonomy, but there are certain, shall we say, stipulations. There are certain power arrangements. There are certain hierarchy and dynamics with the central government in Kuala Lumpur. So that's what the idea is of this, Federation of Malaysia. Now, let's move on. So going into ascertaining the wishes of the people, making sure that this formation is a legitimate one. Early 1962, there is this commission called the Cobalt Commission reported that there was sufficient support from North Borneo for them to be, part of the new Federation of Malaysia. Now, there are some discrepancies with this Cobalt Commission. And there are some questions as to how it was conducted. There were some questions into who was asked, and therefore there are some doubts and there are some accusations of illegitimacy over this commission and its findings. So it was contested actually by a number of parties, most notably Indonesia itself, that this in today's terms, it was very shady the way that it was done. So there were huge questions over the findings and therefore over the legitimacy of the formation of Malaysia, especially for the inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak. In 15 August 1962, there is a New York Agreement where West Irian, this territory called West Irian, is ceded back to Indonesia. Now, there is a whole history to this as well. I'm not going to go into it, but basically, when the Dutch decolonized Indonesia, this part of Irian, which is today's New Guinea, this part of Irian continued to remain under Dutch control. Now, why is this campaign or this issue important for us? Is because the Indonesians had been campaigning very vigorously to get West Irian back under Indonesia. They reasoned that this used to belong to the Dutch East Indies. When Indonesia became independent, technically this territory should belong to us as well. So they campaigned very vigorously. First by diplomatic means, but by 1960 towards 1962, they actually confronted the Dutch. Oh, dramatic foreshadowing over here. Like there is actually a mini prelude confrontation, but this time against the Dutch. And the objective was very clear. They were being very strong posturing. They were being very adamant. They were playing a lot of strong arm politics against the Dutch, and the attempt was to wrestle back West Irian, and eventually, actually, they did manage to achieve this. 15 August 1962 with the New York Agreement. This is internationally recognized, by the way. So the Dutch had to relinquish control, and West Irian went back under the authority of the Indonesian government. Why is this important for us? Is because this really emboldens Sukarno. For all you know about Sukarno as a domestic political leader, Sukarno, right, is a beast, right? He's not the hype beast, but he's a beast on the international stage. He really seeks to project himself, and he does to a very, very large degree. And things like this, right, scores enormous points for him. It really emboldens his confidence in terms of his stature as a world leader, and not just an Indonesian leader. And so this kind of thing really kind of feeds into his mentality, the kind of level of diplomatic aggression that he has. This kind of victories, right, would further embolden his agency on the world stage. So that would be significant to us because actually you take a look at the next checkpoint, 20th January 1963. I think this is about, let's do math, about 4 or 5 months after the New York Agreement. Indonesia Declaration of Confrontation against Malaysia. So, I want you to see that certain events within the vicinity of each other, there may actually be a causal relationship between them, motivating factors that are building upon one another, eventually leading to a certain event or whatnot. So on 20th January 1963, Indonesia, Sukarno comes out and kind of like announces that there's an active campaign going on to crush Malaysia, for what it is. 12 April 1963, first recorded instance of Indonesian infiltration operations, which means to say that this conflict now has evolved from just being something about perhaps sovereignty or territory, or maybe even about legitimacy or self-determination. Now it has evolved and taken on a character of security as well. So the nature of the conflict is evolving, and it is evolving very fast. And it's now more sensitive, it's now more highly escalated because of this security element, this infringement of sovereignty, this military dimension that is now being introduced into the conflict. August 1963, there is a formation of this regional organization called Mafilindo. You can see over here Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. This was on the surface, this was an attempt by the three countries to kind of try to resolve their problems and issues diplomatically. Okay, so that's the official reason for the formation of this organization. Why you ask Philippines is involved is because actually Philippines also opposes the formation of Malaysia. So that's another story for another time, but that's why these three nations are involved over here, and the official reason is to try to resolve their matters on a diplomatic level and to make sure that the formation of Malaysia is a legitimate process. That's the surface kind of, or rather, that's the official kind of reason. But many academics have seen Mafilindo as an attempt, it is a mechanism, it is a tool for the Indonesian and Filipino leaders to actually slow down the formation of Malaysia. So they were trying to create hurdles and barriers to stop it, and I think Mafilindo was one such attempt in order to slow down the formation of Malaysia, because by this point in time they had already set a date that Malaysia was going to be formed in September 1963. 14 September 1963, UN report showed general endorsement of Malaysia from the Borneo states. So this is a UN endorsed report, but same thing, there are certain discrepancies, there are certain loopholes, there are certain questions, and it really raises the credibility, raises the issue of credibility of these referendum processes or these UN reports and so on and so forth. Sukarno constantly brings up the point over here that this is not right, something shady is going on, this was engineered, this was manipulated, this was exploitative, so on and so forth. So he constantly brings up those kind of stuff. Doesn't matter, 16 September 1963, the Federation of Malaysia is formed. And you can see immediately after that, there are the bilateral relationship between Malaysia and Indonesia, it really starts to deteriorate. First with diplomatic deterioration, and then later on it escalates into military confrontation. So you can see later on the following events over there all have a military security kind of character. There is actually a war, a limited war that will go on in the Borneo states during this 2-year period of time. It is so, shall I say, it is so intense that even the British and Australian troops are involved in the conflict as well. So this is one of those wars that you don't really hear about. It's not as cool as the Vietnam War, I guess, but nonetheless, it was something that was going on in the jungles of Borneo, and it was going on for quite a period of time, at least for a period of 1 year plus to 2 years. You can see my final checkpoint in this timeline here is 30th September 1965. Remember, there was a attempted coup against Sukarno, and actually it was only when Indonesia was transiting to its next leader, Suharto, that the Konfrontasi campaign died down. Suharto himself was the main reason for the reversal of policy against Malaysia, because Suharto had a very different approach towards regional relationships. Suharto had a very different approach towards Malaysia. So, but again, I think that's another story for another time. But yeah, so this is the entire time frame of Konfrontasi. I know it's a bit of a volume of content, but kind of like these are the highlights. But this is just the narrative, right? We're looking from one thing to the next. Haven't really explored any of the issues, the causes, the motivating factors, and things like that. But yeah, I think it's a good baseline to have content understanding before we go on into the big issues. So now we go on to explore some of the issues, and through the sources, the source work that we'll do in class, we will continue to explore some of this. So remember, the main question that we have over here is about who you can keep both in mind, like who is responsible, and as well as you can also keep in mind the nature of the conflict, like what are the core issues and things like that. The slides are structured along the lines more of the nature of the conflict. So as you go down the slides, I'll give you several dimensions to the conflict. But yeah, you can keep the idea of responsibility at the back of your mind as well. So let's start off first with the sovereignty dimension. Now, this conflict definitely has a territorial character, right? It is to do about territory and the authority over territories. So definitely there is a sovereignty dimension over here. When we unpack the term sovereignty, not only is there the element of territory, but there is that element of ultimate authority as well. Like, who is the ultimate authority? Who is the legitimate authority over, certain tracts of land or even certain tracts of water? But in this case, we are looking at territory to do more with land and things like that. So, one of the key things you might want to understand about this sovereignty dimension is that Sukarno himself, as I mentioned, with this conflict, Sukarno as a personality, a lot of his influence plays into the cause of this conflict. So Sukarno had this idea. It's not a new idea, but I think he's one who really actively had it at the forefront of his mind. He has this idea of what we call Indonesia Raya, and the Indonesian conception of their sphere of influence within the archipelago, that area over there. So sphere of influence, you might have come across it already, because when you deal with Cold War, you look at USSR, USA, looking at their spheres of influence in Eastern and Western Europe and so on and so forth. So I think you understand the concept of a sphere of influence. Actually, in Southeast Asia with Indonesia and with Sukarno especially, they also had their idea of their sphere of influence. I'm just going to skip ahead to the map over here. And the idea here is that Sukarno had this idea of Indonesia Raya, and the sphere of influence encompass all the red areas that you see over here. So you can see that actually, when it comes to the red areas, right, you can see very importantly that West Malaysia and East Malaysia and Singapore as well, they are under this so-called Indonesia Raya sphere of influence. So there are these huge conceptions of Indonesian dominance in the Malay archipelago. Again, the Malay archipelago being, the red area that you see over here, part of maritime Southeast Asia. So the problem comes in here when the ideas for the formation of Malaysia starts to come about, because immediately this poses a threat. This sets up as a conflict against Indonesian perceived dominance. This is something that kind of like thwarts their plans a bit, and it runs counter to what they conceive of as their sphere of influence. So with this new federation, which is supposed to consist of all this kind of stuff, it would put a spanner in the works of what Sukarno saw as Indonesia's sphere of influence. I think there is a further layer to this sense of threat that he saw, because at that point in time, the British were still very much involved in the affairs of Malaysia and Singapore. And so not only is there a sense of threat from Malaysia itself, like Malaysia, but Malaysia together with British involvement, I think that was a real sense of threat for him in his own concept of his sphere of influence. These are, in his mind, these are competitors, and these are agents and actors that would run conflict to what plans he has and what agenda he has for the Malay archipelago. I'll unpack a bit more of this later when we talk about Sukarno and his personality. With regards to the sovereignty dimension, as I mentioned earlier just now as well, a lot of questions were being raised as to the reliability or the authenticity or the legitimacy of the referendum processes in North Borneo, the North Borneo territories. Because while there were certain processes, there were referendums and whatnot that was implemented in those territories, a key question was, were these findings representative of the people's will, or was it something that was engineered by the British, something that was manipulated in order to push the Malaysia plans forward? So that was a big question, and I'll leave you guys to read more about it, but I'll cover in tutorial as well as to what exactly were the discrepancies and what exactly were the problems to do with the referendum process in these territories that made it question whether the sovereignty here was legitimate, whether it was legitimately derived, or was it something engineered and manipulated. Anyway, it is a point of conflict nonetheless, regardless of whatever it is, because Sukarno perceived that this was illegitimately done, and therefore the point of conflict and the point of tension arose from there. So yeah, these are things that have to do with the sovereignty dimension. Okay, so going on to the next one. Sorry, there's a bit of a technical error there. I don't know if it got cut off or something, but yeah, let me know if it does. But if not, then we are cool. We can just move on. Yeah, okay. So going on to the next area and aspect or dimension of the conflict that I want to explore is the security one. As I mentioned to you just now, sometimes when we look at conflicts and the evolution or the development of conflicts, right, we can see that it might have started out something, but it would evolve to take on a new character, or maybe just some additional dimensions to the initial source of the conflict or the initial characteristics of the conflict itself. So with Konfrontasi, like just now when we looked at it, a lot of it had to do with the contest of sovereignty, the questioning of authority, and who's the legitimate authority over the territories in question. But as the conflict evolves and things get more heated and more intense, we are looking at the conflict taking on new dimensions and evolving to adopt a more aggressive tone, one that is more belligerent, one that is more confrontational, and a lot of it comes down to the introduction of the security element, or maybe even because of the shall we say, increasing aggressiveness of Sukarno himself. So those are the kind of things that would actually take the conflict up to the next level. Now, so a lot of this conflict, as I mentioned just now, has you have to understand the central figure of Sukarno. Now, like what I mentioned just now, you can see point number 2 over here. Malaysia as the neo-colonial plot that threatened the security of Indonesia. Now, let's unpack the big term over here, neo-colonial plot. Now, what does neo-colonial mean? Is basically the idea that there will be a continuing influence of the former colonial power in Southeast Asia. So, what the neo-colonial plot here refers to is Sukarno's belief that Malaysia, this new nation called Malaysia, or this construction of the Federation of Malaysia, this whole thing, right, he believes and he perceives it as something engineered by the British to continue their influence in Southeast Asia despite decolonizing the various colonies under their control. So it's to them, to the Indonesians, to Sukarno, it's a disguised form of colonialism, or is colonialism continued but in more indirect forms. That's why we use the term neo-colonial. It's something that resembles the colonialism of old, but now it is in a new form, it is in a modified form, maybe in a more disguised form, and so on and so forth. So Sukarno believes that Malaysia is a neo-colonial plot designed, engineered by the British, together with the Malaysians, maybe even with the Singaporeans as well, where they have come together, to kind of manipulate their way through things in order to construct this nation, and also to help the British continue to retain their influence in Southeast Asia despite having decolonized these various countries. And we take a look at this kind of things for now, and the way I phrased it and used the word is like, Sukarno perceives it, and I don't really want to, or rather, I want to introduce some balance to this whole thing because Sukarno reacting to the context of that time. I mean, he really does have some things to work on because as I mentioned just now, a lot of the referendum processes that were implemented to solicit the views of the people. As I mentioned just now, there were a lot of discrepancies and there were a lot of loopholes and there were a lot of in shall we say a lot of questionable things that were being done lah at that point in time, which really gave Sukarno the fodder in order to concretize his beliefs and really to take it to the next level lah. So yeah, this perception was very real at that point in time, and Sukarno was a product of his time. He's reacting to the context and the circumstances at that point in time as well. So the two of them comes together to produce the effect. So I don't want to create a narrative or a scenario where I'm completely blaming everything on Sukarno or I'm giving him absolute responsibility. I don't think that's the idea that we would have here lah, because clearly there's responsibility on both sides of the story. Sukarno himself, he is as a person, right, and he's quite representative of his country. They're fiercely nationalistic. At that point in time, Sukarno, he's anti-Western, he's anti-imperial as well, and they really wanted the removal of all traces of colonialism in the region, and especially in the Malay archipelago. I jump ahead to point number 4. Don't forget that the Cold War is still going on, and just now I mentioned that Sukarno himself, he sees himself as not just a regional leader, but to some extent as a world leader as well. Sukarno is actually one of the big 5 members of the non-aligned movement. He's a leader of a global movement called the non-aligned movement, and I'll unpack this in tutorial. But yeah, so this non-aligned movement, the principles and the philosophy and the approach behind it is very much in line with what we are seeing over here, which is that it is anti-colonial, it is anti-imperial, it doesn't want to get caught up in great power politics, whether it's the Cold War or the former traces of colonialism. Sukarno's idea is that the region should be rid of all these things and they should enjoy independence and that kind of genuine autonomy from independent states, or rather as independent states. So this idea that Malaysia is a neo-colonial plot, it is something engineered by the British, there's some manipulation going on here to retain their influence in the region, is something that really doesn't sit well with Sukarno. And actually at that point in time, there's quite a lot of evidence and events that give credence to his belief that this is really happening. And the last point over there, another thing to do with his character is that with disagreements, political leaders, they have a choice as to how do they want to manage disagreements and conflict and tensions. And the fact that this issue was escalated into the security realm, this issue adopted a more militaristic character. I mean, a lot of this comes down to the agency of the leader, what choices he makes and what kind of things he does on his part. How does he steer foreign policy of his country? So a lot of it came down to him, and the fact that the conflict escalated to adopt a military and security character. I would say that a lot of it came down to the personality of Sukarno and the agency and what he chose to do. So with regards to the security thing, and I'm not talking about like low level kind of stuff. There are really high level kind of stuff. As I mentioned just now, there's a military campaign going on in Borneo, but then there are all these other separate incidences that are happening within the Malay archipelago itself. You can see the potential for an even bigger conflict is there. Like, look at the Sunda Straits crisis. That one involves British aircraft carriers and destroyers. I mean, these are like ships of the line. These are like heavyweights lah, basically. And if just one small thing goes wrong, the whole thing can escalate. You've been through the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think. So you kind of understand that kind of sensitivities to do with security-based conflicts where one wrong move could escalate it into something unimaginable, something that bigger than originally conceptualized. Singapore is not spared from this, and I think this one you may have heard about it more. Maybe like you came across it in SS or something like that. But there were terrorist bombings in Singapore. Indonesian paratroopers, or rather, sorry, Indonesian Marines, they um, planted a bomb at this place called McDonald House. It's at Dhoby Ghaut, next to Dhoby Ghaut MRT. You can go and see the commemorative plaque over there. I think the building is still there, but I want you to see that the situation is quite escalated, and there is not only an infringement of sovereignty. When the Indonesian Marines, they make their way into Singapore and do this kind of illegal stuff, but it is a violent nature as well. So it's quite escalated lah, this conflict. The last dimension that I want to explore, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, is the connection between domestic events and regional events. So this one requires you to throwback to what's happening in Indonesia, what you learned from Team 1 about how is Indonesia doing at this point in time under Sukarno. Actually, by the 60s, Indonesia is not doing well. When Indonesia transits into guided democracy, the economic counterpart is called guided economy, and a guided economy is a travesty, is a shambles to the Indonesian economy. It is wrecking the Indonesian economy, and it's just not doing well. So economically speaking, Indonesia is kind of not doing well under Sukarno. Politically speaking, Sukarno is facing a very difficult time trying to balance out his two major allies, the military and the communists. Remember the PKI? So the both parties don't like each other, and they're putting a lot of pressure on him to balance out the relationship. So he's facing a lot of pressure from that kind of stuff as well. So politically it's quite unstable, economically it's even worse, and history has shown that there are many leaders who, when facing such domestic crises, would turn the gaze of the nation to foreign policy as a means of a distraction, right? As a means to kind of take the heat off them and kind of to throw the people's attention somewhere else. So that kind of tactic you can see all across history lah, not just in Southeast Asia, but everywhere in the world. Even now, actually, with I mean, of course, the top case study comes to mind, Trump's America. I think that a lot of these kind of tactics are being played right now as well, like literally right now. Yeah, man, how can they ban TikTok? I mean, man, it's my like number one source of entertainment and my number one tutorial for dance moves. Joking, I can't dance. So the domestic, going back to the domestic side of things, a lot of pressures from the domestic scene, and that could also be one of the causal motivating factors leading towards Konfrontasi as a campaign. I don't know whether it's the biggest one. I think definitely there are connections between this and Konfrontasi itself. But I don't know whether the domestic pressures point is going to be the biggest motivating factor or the core issue surrounding Konfrontasi. I think it's one of those layering factors, and the core issues reside somewhere else, like with sovereignty or security or the leader. But yeah, I think it's a worthwhile point to explore this one as well. So the last point over there, as I mentioned, one of Sukarno's key allies are the communists, the PKI, and the whole neo-colonial plot thing that we talked about just now. The PKI were really pushing Sukarno to act upon it and to see it as such. So it further, on the one hand, he has his own agenda, but on the other hand, when you look at it from this angle, it seems as though Sukarno is pressured by his own domestic groups as well. He's kind of constrained in that sense. So there's that added element to what motivates Sukarno in his aggression and in his confrontation. Now, the last few slides over here, I thought that, since it is a SPQ topic, it would be good to give an initial taste of the sources. And I just chose, from one specific sitting in the United Nations, somewhere around September 1964. So, giving you a taste of some of the things being said at that point in time. You can just go through them yourself, get a taste of what people viewed the issue at that point in time, and the kind of sources that you will be given with regards to this topic. So you can take your time to read it, and you can take it up with me in class. But when we come to tutorials, I will give you another set of sources. But I thought this particular session was interesting for the things that it reviewed about what the conflict was about, and the kind of responsibilities that are attributed to different parties with the conflict. And the last slide over here, as I mentioned before, I think the conflict really only ends when Sukarno is deposed from power, and when a new leadership and a new regime comes to office in Indonesia under Suharto and the new order. Suharto, it's not just the fact that Suharto comes into power, therefore Konfrontasi ends. I think we have to see this in context of what Suharto is all about when it comes to regional relationships. Suharto had a very different mindset and approach towards regional relationships, and because of his very different, almost 180 turnaround from Sukarno, therefore there was a complete reversal of foreign policy with regards to their attitudes towards the region, with even regards towards their attitudes towards the Western nations. So that is something that is possible with a new regime and with a new leader that thinks very differently from the previous one. So yeah, I'll leave it as that for now. And I know there's quite a lot of content, but this is just the content lecture, so it's going to be quite heavy. And then after that, we're going to go into the sources. Hopefully, from this content lecture, you will get more idea when you read the sources. You get more context as well. Yeah, so excited to go into this, and I will see you guys during tutorials. DJ Anish out.